What if the person who once made you feel more seen than anyone in your entire life suddenly becomes the one person you cannot reach? Stay with me, because what Carl Jung discovered about the psychology of emotional withdrawal in feeling dominant individuals will completely reframe what you think you are witnessing when an empath closes the door to their interior world and stops answering from the other side of it. Most people assume emotional unavailability belongs to a specific type of person: the avoidant, the narcissistic, the chronically defended, the person who was never really present to begin with. They do not expect it from the empath, from the person who felt everything, shared everything, who made their inner life so visible and so accessible that you forgot. Somewhere along the way, that access was a gift rather than a given. And then one day the gift is gone, and what remains in its place is something so unfamiliar it takes time to even name it correctly. Here is what Jung understood about the empath's relationship to emotional availability that most people never consider. The empath does not simply feel their own emotions. They feel the emotional atmosphere of every space they inhabit. Every conversation, every silence, every shift in the energy of a room registers in their nervous system as information they did not choose to receive but cannot choose to ignore. Jung called this the burden of the permeable psyche, the inability to move through the world with the kind of emotional insulation that most people maintain automatically, unconsciously, as a basic feature of daily functioning. For the empath, availability is not a posture they adopt in intimate relationships. It is their default state of existence. They arrive open, they remain open, extend themselves outward toward other people's inner lives with a consistency and a depth that most people experience as extraordinary because, by any objective measure, it is. This means something crucial that most people only understand in retrospect. When the empath becomes unavailable, they are not simply closing a door that was always there. They are building a door where there was never a wall. Jung identified the specific conditions that produce this transformation, and they are not what most people expect. It is not a single wound that does it. The empath is built, psychologically, to absorb single wounds, to process them, metabolize them, find the meaning within them, extend grace across them. Single wounds do not produce emotional unavailability in the feeling type. They produce depth. They produce the particular quality of compassion that only exists in someone who has been hurt and chose, deliberately, to remain open anyway. What produces unavailability is something far more specific. Jung called it the chronic empathic inversion. The prolonged experience of having one's emotional availability consistently met not with reciprocity, but with consumption, of extending care and receiving need in return, of offering presence and receiving performance, of bringing one's entire interior life into a relationship and discovering, slowly, across months or years, that the exchange was never actually mutual. The psyche registers this imbalance long before the conscious mind is willing to name it, and it responds eventually with a form of self-preservation so complete it surprises even the empath themselves. Here is the moment Jung described as the threshold of inversion. It arrives quietly, without announcement, without a defining incident that could be pointed to as the cause. The empath wakes up one morning or sits in a conversation that is identical to 100 conversations before it, and something inside them simply does not extend outward the way it always has. Not because they decided not to, because the mechanism that always moved automatically has stopped moving. Jung called this the exhaustion of the feeling function, not a permanent loss of capacity, a temporary necessary suspension of the function that has been operating without rest, without reciprocity, without adequate restoration for longer than the psyche can sustainably maintain. The empath does not become emotionally unavailable because they stopped caring. They become emotionally unavailable because they cared without interruption for so long, in conditions that did not support that caring, that the system required shutdown to survive. Now here is the part that will stay with you long after everything else fades. The empath who has become emotionally unavailable is not experiencing the absence of feeling. They are experiencing the fullness of feeling with nowhere left to put it. Jung described this as the inverted interior. The emotional life that was always directed outward now has no safe direction to move in, and so it turns inward, becomes dense, becomes still, becomes invisible to everyone watching from outside. What looks like coldness is actually saturation. What reads as indifference is actually the opposite of indifference. It is feeling so concentrated, so unprocessed, so unwitnessed by anyone capable of actually receiving it, that it has had to become private simply to exist without causing further damage to the person who carries it. The empath in this state is not gone. They are more present to their own interior than they have perhaps ever been. They are simply no longer sharing that presence, not as punishment, as protection, of themselves first, but also in ways they may not consciously articulate, of you. Jung observed something about this phase that most people find difficult to accept. The emotional unavailability of the empath is not a problem to be solved. It is not a symptom requiring intervention. It is not a distance that the right words, the right gesture, the right demonstration of remorse can simply collapse. It is a passage, a necessary and sovereign passage through which the empath must move entirely on their own terms, on their own timeline, according to an internal logic that belongs exclusively to them. Jung called this the period of sacred withdrawal, the time during which the psyche that has given itself away in pieces begins the slow, painstaking work of locating those pieces and drawing them back toward the center, of remembering what it felt like to inhabit itself fully before it learned to perpetually inhabit others instead. No one can accelerate this process from the outside. Attempts to do so do not help. They register in the empath's newly precise interior, as one more demand being placed on a system that became unavailable specifically because demands were all it ever received. What emerges on the other side of this passage is something Jung considered among the most significant psychological developments available to the feeling type. He called it bounded availability, the capacity to be deeply, genuinely, fully present with another person from within a structure that protects the self. Not the absence of openness. Openness with a foundation beneath it. Availability that is chosen rather than automatic. Presence that is extended from a place of sufficiency rather than from the chronic depletion of someone who gives because they do not yet know how to stop. The empath who has moved through emotional unavailability and emerged on the other side does not love less. They love more accurately. They do not connect less deeply. They connect more selectively. They do not feel less. They feel with greater sovereignty over where that feeling goes and what it is given in exchange for. Carl Jung said that the most profound transformations in the human psyche are never visible at the moment they occur. They happen in the interior, in the silence, in the passages that look from the outside like absence, but are from the inside. The most intensely inhabited periods of a person's entire life. The empath who has become emotionally unavailable is not lost to you. They are lost to the version of the relationship that required them to be perpetually available in order to exist. And somewhere in the quiet of their necessary withdrawal, they are becoming someone who will eventually have more to offer than they ever did before. Not to everyone, not automatically, not without cost to you this time, but to the right person, in the right conditions, with the right reciprocity finally in place, more completely, more consciously, and more beautifully than you can currently imagine.